And I use the pronouns she and her. I just wanted to give everybody a moment to go ahead and silence all electronic devices. Anything that makes a noise, that would be awesome. But welcome, everyone. We're glad you're here. Whether you've been coming for a while or are new here, we're really glad you're here. So today's service will attempt to explain the war in Gaza, its relation to Zionism, and Anti-Semitism in a capsule. Behind the complex and sobering reality of the war, most of us hope for an end to the fanaticism and tribalism that has dogged the Middle East for as long as we can remember. The first step to understand the circumstances behind the war, something we will try to do today. And our chalice lighting words are, if there's a path forward toward peace between Israel and Palestinians, whether in two states or one state, it will begin with all of us moving beyond stereotypes. Israelis are not the same as Netanyahu, and Palestinians are not the same as Hamas. Nicholas Kristof. And now I invite you to stand for the covenant. Love is the spirit of this church, and its service its law. This is our covenant, to dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in love, and to help one another. And our opening song will be in the gray hymnal, Far Too Long Divided by Fear Divided. This is the time where we go ahead and we collect offering, and because this is a member-funded church, anything you can offer, whether that's time, talent, or treasure, would be much appreciated. But this time is for treasure, so if you have any treasure, feel free to share. can now sing out the children. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to try this again. Thom is a retired professor of English and Communications from Pensacola State College. He is a longtime friend of the church and has served as the president of the church roughly around 1994. He is an occasional speaker at the church as well as a very excellent sax player. Please welcome Thom Botsford.
Thank you so much and good morning. Can you hear me? Okay, let me get my notes. And I appreciate you coming out for what is not a light subject. It's a grim subject, I know, but a serious subject. And although I will not offer my advice of what this country should do, what Israel should do, what Hamas should do, I will try to present enough information and enough details for you to follow things better in the news and to think about some of these intractable problems. I've been thinking a lot about this since the October 7th massacres of last year and the deadly war of response in Gaza that's still raging. So let's start with a summary of those developments. The October attack on Israel was a surprise invasion by Hamas and other militant Palestinian groups. About 3,000 rockets were fired, about 3,000 Hamas fighters surged into southern Israel, some of them on these power gliders, you've probably seen, killing 1,319 people that day in 21 communities, and nearly 700 of those were civilians. Additionally, about 250 people were taken hostage. This detail really got to me. Hundreds attending a music festival were slaughtered. Women were raped. Terrorists, reportedly gleeful, did things so outrageous I'm just not going to mention them. This is known as Black Saturday in Israel. It's the first attack on Israeli soil since the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, Israel's War of Independence. Now, accepting responsibility for the attacks, Hamas gave several justifications. One, and perhaps most important, the continued occupation of Palestinian lands since the Six-Day War of 1967. Oh, yes. Now I can. Here we go. You probably know where the Gaza Strip is and the West Bank of Jerusalem. Those are the lands most in question right now. So you can see that's the map of Israel today. So that's the first reason, the occupation of Palestinian land since 1967. And number two, the blockade of the Gaza Strip. Number three, expansion of Israeli settlements in Palestinian areas, such as the West Bank. And rising violence, number four, from settlers in those areas. Maybe some of you recognize Thomas Friedman, the New York Times columnist. He's somebody I turn to a lot for help on understanding the Middle East. I remember reading one of his columns about this time, and he said, seeing what had happened in Israel, I hope the world is ready for what is about to happen in Gaza. And he was right. What did happen and what is still happening has turned Gaza into a hell on earth in the space of about 10 months. At last count, the death toll was more than 40,000, and more than half of those are thought to be women and children. Depending on the accounts, anywhere from 6,000 to 25,000 people are missing. 92,000 have been wounded, 9,300 detained, 1.9 million displaced. Attacks on the infrastructure have been devastating. The healthcare system has collapsed, and the risk of famine is very high. More than half of the houses in Gaza have been damaged or destroyed. Most schools are closed, and at least a third of Gaza's tree cover and farmland are gone, according to various sources. You know, in retirement, I have time to read, and I have found that the New York Times commentary department is absolutely outstanding, and unlike other parts of the paper, you can't pigeonhole these columnists. They run the entire spectrum, and the Times pays them well, and the writing is very good, even when you disagree. Gosh, I think about $20 a month to get a description online, and it really is worth it for, just to get that information, the commentary alone. I'm not working for the New York Times, by the way. Now, New York Times columnist Nicholas Kristof, he noted in May that a child in Gaza is killed every 10 minutes. UNICEF says Gaza is the most dangerous place in the world to be a child. And I'm quoting Kristof now, because of America's support for Israel's invasion and diplomatic protection for it at the UN, Kristof wrote, this blood is on our hands. So he brings it right home to us. Not everybody disagrees with that on the New York Times list of columnists, for sure. I'll show you some others who don't. But that is a point of view. Much of the damage comes from airstrikes. Kristof reported in January that Israel had dropped 29,000 bombs in Gaza just from early October to mid-December of last year. Now, if you want to compare that, the United States dropped 3,678 bombs on Iraq from 2004 to 2010. 6 years, about 3,700. 2 months, 29,000 bombs. Among the weapons that we have supplied Israel are 10,000 highly destructive 2,000-pound bombs. They are unguided missiles. They cause a lot of collateral damage, death, and injury. Those are just the facts, as far as I could tell. In some ways, Israel is an outpost of the United States when you think about it. Most of us would be more comfortable living there than in any other country, and many of us know people with strong ties to Israel. To many Christians, Israel plays a part in the prophecy for the end times. More broadly, Americans are familiar with the Old Testament, not with the Quran. They recognize we live in a Judaic Christian culture, not a Muslim one, so it shouldn't be surprised that most Americans are uncritical supporters of Israel right now, apparently. It's hard to know for sure, depending on how you ask the question. But it's just true that we give Israel more aid, foreign aid, than any other country. Between 1946 and 1922, we gave Israel $317.9 billion, more than we spent in Korea, more than we spent in Vietnam, more than we spent in Iraq, and more than we spent in Afghanistan. As for the current war in Gaza, Reuters reported June 29th that the Biden administration in mid-December had sent these bombs. And yet, Biden, as you know, appeared upset over the humanitarian toll. We saw that. He spoke out about it, but he didn't do anything else, really. He didn't act firmly to reduce the toll. He didn't stop the shipment of offensive weapons. And the reason, politics probably. Maybe you've noticed that the events of October 7th and the war in Gaza have become controversial on campuses, some places, far more so than most foreign wars. And this happens to parallel a rise in anti-Semitic expression and crime in the U.S. lately. These factors, the protest, the anti-Semitism, are inflaming the fears of Jews everywhere. But on the country's best-known campuses and around the world have been pro-Palestinian protests and occupations. They've made headlines. And the language of protest and reaction on both sides has become toxic. I think that's one opinion I do have. Here's a real favorite of mine, writing for the New York Times, Melissa Goldberg. She had this to say about the pro-Palestinian protesters on campus and the way they behave when people pass by. Sometimes they yell out Zionist, racist, murderer, things like that. Anyway, Melissa Goldberg said, given the moral enormity of mass death, displacement, and starvation in Gaza, maybe deferring to mainstream Jewish sensitivities means just going along with respectability politics, just whitewashing horror in the name of civility. So these more radical protesters in their methods, some of them quote Stokely Carmichael, you may recognize that name from the civil rights era, who said, in order for nonviolence to work, your opponent must have a conscience. The U.S. has none. And there are some people who think that way. But I don't believe that most people protesting on campus share that radical view. But they are appalled by the death and destruction in Gaza, and they can't understand how an operation like that can continue. How many deaths is acceptable? Are unlimited deaths of innocent people the price we must pay to defeat Hamas? Do we have to do this? Now, as I said, the inflammatory language doesn't help. Words such as racist, genocide, and Zionist, they've been tossed around as insults in rallies. And of course, this again outrages many Jews and supporters of Israel because they are still reeling from those October 7th massacres. So, counteroffensive against the protesters, and you could see this happening in real time. The Friends of Israel stepped up. You see anti-Semitism ads everywhere. Many of them are in places of influence and power. They redoubled their efforts to alert the public to anti-Semitism. But then they started fighting back on campus. Some of the protesters were hounded, photographed, and reportedly blacklisted from future employment following complaints that Jewish students felt unsafe. More significantly, supporters of Israel pressured trustees and administrators at Harvard, Columbia, and other well-known universities to explain why so-called anti-Semitic expression had not been shut down. There was even a congressional hearing staged by the House Republicans, grilling several college presidents on this issue, and some of them resigned later. Meanwhile, well-funded pro-Israel lobbying groups like AIPAC dumped millions of dollars into two Democratic primaries recently, one for the seat in New York held by Jamal Bowman, and one for the seat in Missouri held by Cori Bush. Both of these black representatives lost their race. Millions of dollars were pumped in to defeat them, and cynics would just say, here you go, Israel has just purchased itself 2 congressional seats. So this is a grim picture to me. And I can understand sometimes why some people just avoid the news altogether, because there's no easy answer to this anywhere in sight. And the more we examine the history of the war, or more properly, the series of wars, the more we might wish not to be involved at all in the Middle East, if only we could be neutral and not have to think that our tax dollars are paying for those 2,000-pound bombs. Now, the history of this conflict is complex, but we have to try a little bit to put it in a nutshell. So take a deep breath, a little history, and at the risk of oversimplifying, we might say that the story of modern Israel begins during World War I, when Zionists lobbied, especially in Britain, for a Jewish state in Palestine. The result was a declaration in 1917, the Balfour Declaration, that said Britain viewed with favor a national home for the Jews in Palestine. So, after the Allies defeated the Ottoman Turks in World War I, Palestine was no longer under control of the Ottomans. That was the time to press for a state, a Jewish state. But the governments of the Allies were eventually lobbied not only by Jews who wanted a state in Israel, but from many Palestinian Arabs who did not want the new state. During this interwar period, immigration of Jews to Israel increased, much to the dismay of resident Palestinians. There were skirmishes and disagreements, but it was not until after World War II that the matter of a Jewish homeland came to a head. It's important to note that diplomats in the United Nations came up with a partition plan for this region about the time Israel was defeating its opponents in the War of Independence, 1948. Which established the Jewish state. Arabs in the Middle East, however, were quick to condemn it then, as many still do. They refused to recognize Israel, and so the war, or wars, would continue to this day. There was a war over the Suez Canal in 1956, the Six-Day War in 1967, the Yom Kippur War of 1973, and then the first uprising, or Intifada, in Gaza in 1985, which, by the way, marked the birth of Hamas after that Intifada. And then subsequent Intifadas throughout the next 40 years or so, culminating in the attacks that we saw on October 7th. Because this was Israel under the Palestinian Mandate in Britain, and you see at that time it included Jordan, known as Transjordan, but that eventually disappeared. Now, after the Six-Day War, look at the difference. This is before, and this is after. After the Six-Day War, Israel had all of that in green. And it was cause for celebration. Well, Zionism played a big role in these developments, inspiring immigration to Israel, promoting the establishment of settlements, and setting up the government. Today we may hear, as I mentioned, that word hurled as an insult, spoken in the same tone of voice you might use to yell murderer and racist. Given the history of Zionism and the good intention of many Zionists, I think it's unfair and unwise to use Zionist as a term of contempt. I did a little studies, very short introduction to Zionism that was excellent, written by Professor Stanislavski, and he says, well, he gives this background. See, at this time, especially in Eastern Europe and Russia, Jews were systematically mistreated by the prevailing Christian culture, as they have since antiquity. The Zionist thinkers and journalists in those days were certain that the world's Jews needed a land of their own. They considered several parts of the world, and this is way back when, early in the 20th century. They considered several parts of the world, including Argentina, parts of Africa. But in the end, they chose Palestine, where their culture had roots that we see in the Old Testament. So the definition of Zionism since the early days has centered on the need for a home that is free from domination for non-Jews. The Zionist movement embraced the homeland more than anything else, but other things too, such as protecting Jewish culture, reinvigorating Hebrew, and the like. The only problem with these plans to establish the state of Israel, as you probably know, was the population of Palestinian Arabs already living in the area. What's to be done about them? Well, the Zionist movement has been criticized, rightly probably, for not taking serious note of the people living in Palestine and planning some kind of humane alternatives. That didn't happen. By the way, this is the man credited with founding Zionism in the late 1800s, Theodor Herzl. And he thought, he's one of a few people who did give some thought to what to do seriously with the Palestinians. He said, really, you don't have to worry. when we come in and we put up the new state of Israel, it's going to be advanced, it's going to be improvements, life is going to be so much better. They'll be freed from their feudal overlords because they live in a feudal system. And then you might say that was naive to think that would be enough, but that was a sincere thought of many Zionists. Others thought, well, gosh, the Arabs have so much else in the Middle East, why can't those folks just go to one of those countries? Well, again, as I said, the year 1948 brought a renewed Declaration of Independence for the State of Israel as they fought this revolutionary war to seize control of the land. And one thing that really gave a boost to the Zionist movement was, of course, the Holocaust. When the Holocaust happened with the millions of people killed by Hitler, suddenly there was not much reservation among the Jewish people worldwide about supporting this homeland. There was a whole lot of support coming forward, and immigration did increase. Now, there's another side of that, to that liberation in 1948. That is referred to by the Palestinians as Nakba. Nakba. It refers to the displacement, ethnic cleansing, dispossession, and or mass killing of about 3/4 of the Palestinian population, about 750,000 people in 1948. They had to leave. Many headed to refugee camps. And in one of those refugee camps in 1962, a man named Yahweh Sinwar was born, who may be one of the masterminds behind the October 7th attacks. So, the question, is it anti-Semitic to question this way of establishing a Jewish state? We go in, we fight a war, and kick the people out. Some would say yes, given the suffering of the Jews and the difficulties Israel has faced with terrorists, and the other side is mostly terrorists. And it turns out, even today, after all that's happened, most of the Palestinian people still respect Hamas. Anti-Semitism to me means hating, slandering, and mistreating Jews solely because they're Jews. If we criticize Israel for its war, are we doing so because Israel is Jewish? Or is it because Israel could have chosen a less violent response to the terrorist threat? The former would be anti-Semitic. The latter, in my opinion, would not be. But it's tricky. Sometimes anti-Semitism can be masked as anti-Zionism, according to Professor Stanislavski. But he says himself, it's unfair to say that opposing Zionism is necessarily the same thing as anti-Semitism. You can be an anti-Zionist and not be anti-Semitic. Many Jews are anti-Zionist. They're not Zionists. And many kinds of Zionists. One proud Zionist is New York Times columnist Bret Stephens. I'll show you his picture in a minute. He's the most pro-Israel writer on the New York Times. He's a proud Zionist who believes anti-Semitism is often packaged in conspiracy theories. According to Stephens, crafty anti-Semites use Jews use devious means to achieve malevolent ends, and therefore must be opposed by any means possible. And then he says, asking Jews to give up Zionism is like asking Muslims to give up Sharia, Stephens declares, explaining that the longing for a return to Israel is deeply intertwined in Jewish religious practices. Passover, for instance, culminates in the resolution next year in Jerusalem. So, the land itself is part of the faith of some Jews. Just as it's not just Jewish people, think of indigenous people. Their land is part of them, right? Now, all of this is a kind of nationalism and tribalism, It's complicated, isn't it? There are many types of Zionists. If you go back earlier, there were a lot of socialists who were Zionists, and they were prominent in starting the kibbutz movement. Kibbutz, you know what I mean. They were labor Zionists. There were even a few Marxist Zionists. Some Zionists were mainly cultural. They were more concerned with preserving Hebrew or creating a healthy environment for Jews wherever they were, so they could have a fully vibrant religious life wherever they were, not necessarily to have to go to a homeland. But again, after the Holocaust, a lot of thinking changed. Actually, when you hear all this criticism of Zionists, what probably those people mean are kind of Zionists known as a revisionist Zionist. Revisionist Zionist. And the revisionists, Menachem Begin was one, for instance. They've been in and out of office for the past 50 years. They're often labeled right-wing, and they are opposed to turning over any land that Israel gained in the Six-Day War, which traditionally has been Palestinian land. Just in the news the other day, a Palestinian family in the West Bank, they were attacked by settlers. The house was damaged and they were chased away. I don't think anybody was killed in that particular instance, but that's a problem. So, the rule of the right wing, which certainly includes Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister today, would nix any plan for a two-state solution. And a one-state solution that gives equal rights to everybody, Jews or not, that's not what they want. They want Israel to be Jewish. A theocracy, if you will. But a democratic theocracy, if you're inside of it. Now, the current Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, remains in office today despite widespread unpopularity, including talk that he allowed billions of dollars from Arab states to enter Hamas so they could have more money to do things, in a way to counter the efforts of the Palestinian Authority on the West Bank. So that's suspect, and he has some problems because of that. But he's in office because of his alliance with fringe right-wing forces, like the group Jewish Home, that are adamantly opposed to ending the war in Gaza, to reaching any peaceful land. Just, if you're not part of the Jewish nation, get out. Seems to be what they want to say. And he can't lose their support, or he may have to step down, and then he might be in trouble because there's some charges pending against him, on the one hand. So where does that leave us? Netanyahu on the one hand, and this guy on the other hand. This guy is Yahweh Sinwar. The latest New Yorker has about a 10-page article on this man. He's the guy calling the shots for Hamas right now. And so many of his colleagues have been killed, but he's hidden way somewhere underneath on all those tunnels. In fact, when there's a proposal to be made on a ceasefire, it takes days to get to him. Of course, because he's so well hidden. You would not want to meet him in person on a dark street. He's a killer. He is a killer. With his own hands. And proud of it. He spent 20 years, I think, and broke out of I forget how many, he's been in different jails. But he is flat out, violence is necessary. Doesn't matter how many people we kill, until we finally get our land back. And he is proudly posing in the ruins of his house. And of course, this has become a trend now. Others, when their houses are bombed, they sit in front of it and take a picture and send it on. He was once in charge of enforcing the morality of Islamist community. He killed a man for showing pornography, just killed him. Little details like that you learn. But right now it may be up to him. So, as I said, I don't have any definite proposals. There we go. Here's another editorial writer for the New York Times. Many of you are probably familiar with him. He's also worth reading. Now, he has come to the conclusion that we are doing what we have to do on this issue. But the most pro-Israel writer on the time is this guy, Bret Stephens. This is the book that I used. I like these books. They're called the Very Short Introductions, and they're written by experts, professors. But it's like you want to take a course, but get a good introduction to it, background. These books are excellent. In fact, they've got them on a lot of different subjects. Oxford University Press. I like those. And lots of articles, good articles being written. Any of you read The Nation magazine? The Nation now comes out every month. It used to be every 2 weeks. And they had this article, Anti-Semitism, a guide for the perplexed. If anybody wants to borrow one of these, you let me know. I'll be glad to pass it on. So that's what it looks like. I did find one thing I want to read to you in closing. And this is in a column written just a few weeks after Black Saturday. Nicholas Kristof tells of one Jewish man whose elderly parents were massacred on October 7th and whose friends were hostages. I don't stop crying, he said. I'm crying for my parents. I'm crying for my friends. I'm crying for those who were kidnapped. I'm crying for the victims on the Palestinian side. And I'm crying for all the trauma. We are just broken. But from these traumatized days, we must learn the lessons of history. Foremost among them is the need to break the pattern of escalating violence that feeds hatred, creates orphans, and replicates indefinitely. Thank you. You can go. Thanks for coming.